Matt, so maybe we could begin by talking about what you see are the general qualities of Hoyland's career, the things that stayed with him and that define him across the decades he worked in.
Well, it's an interesting question as to what are the distinctive qualities, because you'd be distinguishing them from all sorts of different kinds of work. So they might not sound very distinctive. I would say what really singles him out is a sort of immediately noticeable flair or panache or confidence or ability, all of those things. So that you always know it's a Hoyland. It's not just a matter of the high and bold colour. It's to do with that and the handling, and I guess the scale, but it's the touch and the feel for the materials. And there's a sort of, and I think panache is the word really, that he seems to have it more than others. And you could almost say that, I mean, this is to be a bit complicated, that's almost a negative quality, because he's somebody who fixes things, who makes things work. It's not a sort of outpouring from the heart. He's a passionate artist, but he's also a paint technician. And he's incredibly brilliant at that technical side of things, as well as having a sort of emotional maturity and depth of personality, which is conveyed in the panache with which he handles materials.
You're one of the 4 essayists contributing to the publication that accompanies the exhibition, also called The Last Paintings. I wonder if you could say something about your essay and perhaps something about the experiences with his work that were on your mind when you came to write it.
Well, that was a very important essay for me to do, because it was really about many years, many decades, in fact, of me knowing about Hoyland. He was pretty much the first abstract artist I was ever interested in, from when I was still a student. And my interest in him, I realized when I was writing that essay, had remained very strong, even during periods when I thought that I had no interest in him, when I thought that the art debate had moved away from him and I wanted to be where the art debate was. But I realized that even during those times, I was registering and receiving information about his work, because you would always see his work here and there, even when he was out of the spotlight. And I wanted to map in that essay my changing feelings about an artist who himself went through many changes. His work is consistently good, consistently attractive and powerful, and consistently, I think, misunderstood by some people and appreciated by others. And I wanted to paint a picture, as it were, a word picture of all the changes that Hoyland had been through in terms of his own things that he was concerned with, and how the public saw him. And when he had a big public, when he didn't have so much of a big public, or when the public saw him in a certain way as a glamorous figure, and then saw him as a sort of lovable character, this sort of colourful pirate guy, which I think was the sentimental image of him in the last decades, which was, to me, those things have attractions and not attractions. So while in my essay I'm concerned to celebrate an amazingly powerful body of work, and one which I've seen develop over the years, I also was concerned to look at the shadows of that story and the strangenesses, the alienations, the way in which he himself felt alienated from the art audience often. And I guess in my own case, I've had this history of popularizing contemporary art and making films about art and writing books about art and getting people to be interested in it. And I never really was able to do that much with Hoyland's type of art, and certainly not Hoyland himself, because it tended to be either the trendy art that I was looking at or long ago old master art. So he sort of fell out of the range of the programs and books that I produced. So I was glad with this essay to sort of correct that error.
You first became aware of Hoyland's work when you, or maybe when you became aware of these particular qualities in it?
Well, when I was 20, I was at art school, and I didn't really know that I hadn't been to any contemporary art shows. I didn't really know what contemporary art was. I thought it was Picasso or Chagall or something. And my tutor at the time said, you haven't really been to any contemporary art shows, have you? And so I sort of scratched my head a bit, and I made it a mission to find one. And it happened to be John Hoyland at Waddington. And the qualities that I've always appreciated in him, and I've always been in his work, despite superficial style changes over many decades, were immediately apparent to me, but I didn't know that they were peculiar to him. I thought that, oh, here's some contemporary art, maybe it's all like this. I knew, though, immediately that it was very abstract, that there was no picturing, but I did recognize something that we did at art school, which was that we painted, and that we tried to make paint have some kind of animated quality, even at that young age. And I could see that here was somebody who did that to the absolute max.
Maybe you could sort of step back a bit and talk a little bit about, more broadly, about Hoyland's arrival on the scene, his status in the 60s or in the 70s, which was sort of where you came in somewhere in the middle of that, I think.
Well, by the time I discovered Hoyland was the mid-70s, and his career had already been underway for nearly 15 years. And by the mid-70s was really the peak of his sort of superpowered, spotlit, center stage career, where if you were interested in art at all, you knew about him, and he stood for a certain set of values. And his career was established long before I went to art school. It was established in the 60s, and he was known as somebody in the UK who was a young man who did something that continued the legacy of New York abstract expressionism, which was a movement of the 50s. He was a young man in the 60s who did something fresh and new with that. If you could get your head around that, you know, there were such figures as Mark Rothko and Jackson Pollock, a very long way away in America, historical figures who were marvelous. Some were still alive, some had died. If you could get your head around that as an important thing, here was the English guy who did it. And he stood for that almost more than any other English abstract artist, I'd say, in the 60s. And he became more and more that figure who stood for that, right up until the end of the 70s, really. And when that reputation started to slip away, it was simply because that discussion was no longer center stage.
Looking forward to the current exhibition and publication, how do you feel that early work, the work of the 60s and 70s, differs from his late paintings, his last paintings, the paintings he made from the early 2000s and until his death in 2011?
I think that there are more continuities and more important and profound continuities between Hoyland's early 60s work and the work at the end of his life. But there certainly are differences. I think on the whole, there are superficial differences, but maybe there's one important difference. But the superficial differences are that through the 60s and the 70s, you get an artist who's going from stains of very strong color with some heavier, thicker materials, to an artist who's really using thick materials a lot and is very interested in the difference between patches of thickness and patches of thinness. So you've got color working, variations of color working on a canvas, but also thicknesses and thinnesses. And you've got almost in the 70s, you can see, well, here's a modern guy doing abstract art. Somehow Van Gogh is in that picture. He's manipulating the buttery paint like Van Gogh. I guess in the 60s, it's more sort of Morris Lewis. It's a thin materials mostly with vibrant color. The big difference in the last few decades is of not that thick, buttery surface, a much more sheeny, opalescent, iridescent, almost kitschy kind of surface, verging on, I would say, the repellent, a sort of Miami kitschy glitteringness, which you would, in many contexts, avoid, but which he made work. But you could say the continuity is that he made very bright and vulgar colors work, so they were subtle and interesting and deep in the 60s and 70s. So in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, where he was using all these glittering effects and opalescent effects, he was able to make that shrieking range of colors work as subtlety. So that there are continuities and there are differences. But I would say perhaps a truly profound difference between the early work and the later work is he opens up to nature in a way. I think before obviously nature is always a presence in any visual artist's mind, but he opened up to a kind of cosmic nature later on, a sort of a sublime, magnificent, awesome nature, not really an English one or a British Isles one, but far away in the tropics, something sort of vast and awesome, particularly to the glowing orb of the sun, but also the sparkling lights and the glowing orbs of the planets and the stars. So he was interested in I suppose he was interested in getting the whole of life into his paintings at all times. But in the later work, you see more of that, his awe at nature and the kind of appreciative feelings that he had about nature from traveling the world a lot and traveling in the tropics.
Maybe you could say something about his very last painting, which is a painting you write about in your essay for the book.
I was very moved to see the stains on the floor in his studio from the very last painting he made, which is I would say a dramatic painting, but also meditative, and maybe because of the obvious associations with his own death, a spiritual painting. Maybe I don't think he was thought of at all in the 60s and 70s as any kind of spiritual figure. He was a cool artist, great technician of paint, and he maybe thought of himself as having all sorts of dimension to his being that he was expressing in his paintings. But I think people found him attractive and intimidating because he was a cool, clever, magnificently efficient artist. What you see in that last painting is someone looking at the big questions, which would have been embarrassing to a younger person, maybe even to a younger Hoyland, and possibly even to the art world generally in terms of its own sort of sense of up-to-dateness and being in touch with the modern. And, it's a painting that in some ways is a mirror to his own wonderment, his own anxieties, those big questions that can't be answered, but which we ask because we're human. So in that sense, maybe it's a sort of self-portrait, that painting. But certainly for anyone seeing it, it means a lot to think that the last few years, he knew that he was getting more frail, and he knew there was illness and that the end was coming. And he was interested in and moved by the deaths of people he knew, and he painted paintings commemorating those deaths, mourning the passing of people he knew. And I think we can see that last painting. I don't think this is over sentimental. I think we can see it as a sort of farewell painting. He's sort of contemplating death, and he's contemplating what art can really give us in terms of those unanswerable questions.
One, I think, perhaps final question. How would you see, we've spoken about the changes in the art world and how that affected Hoyland and how interest perhaps moved away from the particular area that he was working in, and how he also himself changed in the succeeding decades. But how would you see Hoyland fitting in, particularly Hoyland's last paintings, fitting into the contemporary art world, the art world of today?
Well, it's a very interesting issue. How does Hoyland fit in? How does his work fit in? I would say now it probably fits in more than at any point over the last 30 years. When he was a star, he was a local star of British art. He was appreciated abroad, but he was a fish among many other fish. Whereas here, he was a really big fish. And then when he wasn't a star, he worked alone in his head, as it were. The spotlight wasn't on him. He didn't have all the attention. He wasn't the center of all the debates, but he was developing that work. he was developing it as if nothing had happened, as if it didn't matter that he wasn't getting the big shows all the time, that he wasn't getting the attention of reviewers. That work developed and matured and grew as he himself grew emotionally and internally. I think in the last 10 years generally, across the board in art, if one can generalize about something which has so many dimensions to it, which is contemporary art, there's been an opening up to sort of loose, figurative, maybe expressive painting. And that opening has also allowed in abstraction, which does this similar thing, which is loose and open and maybe sincere, not ironic, and maybe even connected to modernism. You know, Hoyland is nothing but a sincere modernist. It's the great modernist artists that fire him up. I think at the moment, he is really a figure who the art world or the audience for art is extremely hungry for, without necessarily all of these people knowing it, knowing that he's the one. We've got hungry souls that need to be fed, and we're wondering if really all this stuff that we see in art fairs is going to feed it. And I think that's why there's this interest in a more sincere type of art. So it's as if he's about to be born again and come back as some kind of really serious, important and profound figure. And I think this show could well be the turning point.